The sound was not of battle, but of violating iron-striking ceremonial gold. It was late November 1532 in the high, cold plaza of Cajamarca, Peru. The great collision began with a prayer book thrown onto the ground, followed by the terrifying ring of European steel against Inca bronze. The seizure of the Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, was the public catastrophe. The brutal shadow war waged against the Inca women was the hidden one. Our topic is the dark truth of what the Spanish Conquistadors did to the female population of the Inca Empire, a campaign of systemic, institutionalized destruction that proved more profound than any simple battlefield defeat. The primary motif, the object that will return, is the Khipu, the knotted record-keeping device, suddenly silenced and ignored. Why did the invaders target the women with such precise, dehumanizing policy? And what silent records did they leave behind of this cruelty? What truth remains when the knot keepers are broken? If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe and comment below where you're listening from. And now, back to the story. The public execution of Atahualpa in 1533 did not end the conquest. It merely shifted the institutional control from outright warfare to administrative captivity. The great wealth of the Inca, the gold of the sun, the silver of the moon, was stripped and melted down, but a deeper prize was sought. The control of lineage, labor, and culture, all held primarily by the women. The highest-born women, the Aclla, chosen women, were immediately seized. These thousands of women, who had served the sun god and the Sapa Inca in ritual and weaving, were marched down the stone highways, away from the high mountains and into the burgeoning Spanish settlements like Lima and Cusco. This was not a chaotic raid, but a systemic deportation and renaming. In the vast estates now claimed by the encomenderos, the women were stripped of their identities. They were no longer called by their sacred names, Cusi, Joy, Mama Oclo, Mother, Anna Warque, Star, but given Christian names like Isabel or Catalina, often simply attached to the name of the Spaniard who claimed them. They became numbers in a cruel inventory of human property, marked not by a brand, but by the absence of their former life. Their heads often shaved to erase their ceremonial braids. The institutional goal was complete erasure of memory through forced assimilation and sexual control. This private hell was the price of defeat. Yet, in the shadows of the compounds, among the quiet, monotonous rhythm of the forced labor, grinding maize, weaving coarse cloth for their new masters, a quiet will to resist persisted. It was not the will of a general or a priest, but the silent shared defiance of memory. They taught their children the hidden meaning of the Inca stars and kept the language, Quechua, alive in whispers. The conquerors often offered a perverse form of mercy. A woman of high lineage might be offered marriage to a Spanish soldier or placed as a privileged servant in a wealthy household. The hidden price, however, was the complete abandonment of her people, her gods, and her right to raise her children as Inca. She was required to become an engine for the conqueror's new society. To refuse this quiet death was to face a darker oblivion in the work pits or the barracks. How much of the spirit can they own if the tongue remains free? The silence imposed upon these women, the denial of their names and their power, was intended to break the heart of the Inca nation. They had been the keepers of history, the spinners of fine cloth that held sacred meaning, and the mothers of the next generation of rulers. By seizing and degrading them, the Spanish sought to sterilize the future of Inca resistance itself. Did they truly believe silence could erase what was woven in? The condition for survival was stated openly and constantly: conversion and compliance, or vanishing into the system of forced labor and sexual servitude. The Spanish demanded not just obedience, but a profound spiritual surrender. Women were coerced into accepting baptism and forced attendance at Mass, designed to replace the intimate, familial worship of the Inca pantheon, Viracocha, Inti the sun, Mama Quilla the moon, with the alien dogma of Catholicism. The goal was to shatter the spiritual authority of the women, who were traditionally responsible for maintaining ritual continuity in the home and community. In the face of this systemic pressure, the required compliance was often met with a single, cold refusal, delivered not in words but in deed. When ordered to discard a small inherited protective fetish, a canoppa, one woman, records suggest her name was Maria after a forced baptism, simply looked at the friar and, without a word, slowly slipped the object into the innermost folds of her clothing, a hidden defiance. This act, repeated countless times, was the cold refusal. The escalation began softly: mandatory attendance and forced labor. It moved to deprivation, withholding rations for sins like speaking Quechua or mourning too openly. And finally, it descended into the silence of the obrajas, workshops, or the sexual demands of the barracks. The pressure was relentless. If they spoke of their gods, they were whipped. If they sang the old songs, their mouths were sealed. Yet, this very force intended to break them became an unexpected armor. The discipline of the Aclla, their training in long, complex weaving patterns, and the silent devotion to ritual inverted its meaning. The silence imposed upon them became the perfect cover. The repetitive, monotonous labor in the obrajas gave them long stretches of time to recite silent prayers, to memorize history, and to communicate through small, non-verbal signals. Their silence became a vow, not to the new god, but to the memory of the old one, a silent oath that preserved their identity beneath the surface of enforced compliance. The core why of the brutality and the price they paid is revealed here. The Spanish realized that to truly control the land and its resources, they had to destroy the Inca concept of Ayllu, the extended family network and community structure. Women were the nexus of the Ayllu, the carriers of kinship and memory, and the literal generators of the labor force. The price of this destruction was the total commodification of the female body, reduced to a womb for new labor and a tool for sexual gratification, in an attempt to erase the Inca worldview forever. They paid for the right to remember with their complete freedom. How does the spirit measure the value of a stolen name? The system was designed to create half-breeds, biologically the children of the conquerors, culturally and spiritually orphans. But the women, stripped of everything else, poured their spiritual resistance into the one thing they still controlled: the silent transmission of culture to their children, teaching them the Quechua language and the old ways under the veneer of Spanish piety. They became the hidden temples of the vanished empire. Can a new generation forget what the mother teaches in secret? The conquerors believed they had silenced the Khipu forever, reducing the knotted cords, the meticulous three-dimensional records of the Inca state, census, and history, to mere curiosities or fuel for bonfires. But the physical destruction of the official records only pushed the practice into a hidden space. The truth did not lie in grand archives, but in the small, forgotten, and domestic corners of the newly established Spanish cities. The motif of the Khipu, supposedly broken, reappeared in the hands of the women. The hidden place was not a vault, but the weaving rooms and the private domestic courtyards of the native quarters. Here, the women performed a wordless rite of memory. The sacred act of weaving, which they were still forced to perform for Spanish masters, was turned into an act of cultural preservation. They continued to use specific dyes, knot patterns, and fiber twists that, to an outsider, looked like simple textiles, but to the initiated, represented mnemonic devices tied to the oral history of the Ayllu. The complex, symbolic language of the Inca was being recoded into the very fabric of their forced labor. The cautious evidence queue surfaces in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, in the form of letters and records of local Spanish magistrates, known as the corregidores. These archives contain frustrated complaints about idolatry and unrest among the native population that could not be traced to any single rebellious leader. The officials noted a strange, stubborn refusal among the women to discard specific worn pieces of cloth or to fully abandon the old calendar, suggesting a memory system was being maintained in plain sight. They described women performing silent, repetitive actions. The measured pouring of chicha, corn beer, onto the ground. A miniature libation to the earth goddess Pachamama, performed just before attending a Christian mass. This was the wordless rite of memory. What was hidden was the fact that the women became the living Khipu. They had transferred the massive data set of the empire, the lineages, the border agreements, the sacred songs, the moral laws, from the physical cords to the collective. shared memory, encoded in their weaving, their language, and their daily ritual acts of defiance. The Spanish thought they had simply seized bodies. They had, in fact, captured the very caretakers of the empire's soul, forcing the most crucial data underground where it could survive. The destruction of the public records ensured the creation of a vast, private, and resilient history, accessible only through the women's collective silence. How do you burn a history that has been hidden in the thread? This was not a formal rebellion, but a generational act of deep cultural sabotage. By refusing to let the thread of memory break, they ensured that the children, the first generation born under Spanish rule, knew who they were, where they came from, and what had been stolen. The very tools of their captivity, the loom, the dye pot, the forced labor, became the instruments of their quiet rebirth. Can the victor truly triumph if the memory of the vanquished lives? The Spanish crown, satisfied that the Inca Empire was defeated and officially converted to Catholicism, began the formal process of administrative erasure. This was not a chaotic burning, but a calculated withholding of ink. In the official colonial records, the registers of births and deaths, the names of the Inca women who had held power, the palace, and the collas, were meticulously blanked or replaced with simple generic Christian titles. The aim was to ensure that future generations, Spanish and native alike, would have no legal or historical basis to claim an Inca past. Their history became a story of missing entries and burned ancestral names. The ink was simply withheld. The only distant witnesses left were whispers. Chroniclers like Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, writing around 1615, preserved fragments of these atrocities not as legal proofs, but as moral arguments. His famous New Chronicle and Good Government is filled with illustrations and passages describing the systematic abuse and forced labor of the women, portraying them as silent sufferers under the boots of the colonial regime. These accounts were treated by the Crown not as evidence, but as seditious literature, the subjective complaints of the vanquished, easily dismissed. They are whispers, not proofs. The opening image, the sound of iron striking ceremonial gold in Cajamarca, echoes now, centuries later, in the cold, distant silence of the Andean highlands. The gold was recoverable, measurable, and melted down. But the knowledge, the history, and the spiritual strength carried by the Inca women proved to be a treasure that could not be liquidated. What the Spanish sought to destroy was a culture. What they created was a hidden, oral tradition of immense resilience, passed through the female line. The final bitter truth is that what the Spanish did to the women was meant to be worse than death. It was meant to be the total erasure of their lineage and memory. They failed. The greatest violence done was that which could not be written down. Subscribe, hit the bell, and like. The stolen history only waits for the thread to be found.